They don't seem the most substantial set of islands on the planet. In terms of the militarization of these islands, I'm not entirely sure what you have to say to your commanding officer to get posted to this kind of communication. It doesn't look an entirely comfortable place to be in an area prone to typhoons. Nonetheless, these tiny islands, and really we're talking about islands that in total for the Spratly Islands group, and we've had enormous controversy over these features, they total around 8 square kilometers of actual land territory that's at stake. So they are tiny features, they are remote from shore, they are uninhabited other than garrisons put upon them by the multiple claimant states, and they've caused enormous controversy, not only for the claims over the territory of the disputed islands, but also the overlaps and overlaps of maritime claims to maritime jurisdiction, and the marine resources within those maritime spaces. So the task I set myself tonight is really to start off with some preliminary comments on claims to maritime jurisdiction, and particularly the role of islands in that context, and then to try and unpack the multiple contested claims to maritime space in the South China Sea. Usually when we're dealing with issues of the South China Sea, we tend to be confronted with an extremely complex picture, maps which show a spider's web of lines crisscrossing one another. So what I'd like to do tonight in the second stage is to try and build that up from the base, and to look at the geographical context, and then the baselines from which maritime jurisdictional claims are made, and then build up the layers to build up that complex web of maritime claims, and particularly to look at some of the implications of the recent developments in terms of claims to maritime jurisdiction, and particularly the claims to extended continental shelf jurisdiction that have been made in the South China Sea, and the reactions to those submissions. Then we'll turn to really what are the critical drivers for these disputes. What's really at stake in the South China Sea, and then look towards the future and the recent developments and the rising tensions. So we've all heard of sea level rise, that's my version of it. But really what we're looking at here is the framework that we have for claims to maritime space based on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And all of the South China Sea states are parties to the Law of the Sea Convention. The only South China Sea state that is the exception to the rule is Cambodia, which isn't really a claimant state to the South China Sea proper, that is located on the Gulf of Thailand. So there we have one critical issue at the outset, is the location of what tends to be called the territorial sea baseline, the starting point for measuring claims to maritime space. Everything to the landward of the baseline is land territory or internal waters under the full sovereignty of the coastal state. Everything to the seaward of the TSB, the territorial sea baseline, as either under sovereignty for territorial sea or under specific sovereign rights for exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. So internal waters such as harbour areas, estuaries of rivers and so forth. And then we have a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. You can see there I've used the capital M to denote territorial sea. Technically this is the correct abbreviation for nautical miles. Often you see little n in the literature. Technically that means nanometers, which doesn't make for an enormously advantageous claim. So the capital M is the correct one, although it looks particularly ugly on the page when you're writing about these issues. So many authors tend to use NN for nautical miles. Beyond the territorial sea, we have a 12-mile contiguous zone. And then what was introduced in the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention is a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Underlying that, you have the continental shelf, and in certain instances, the continental shelf can go beyond the 200-mile limit. And that gives rise to areas of so-called extended continental shelf. So many coastal states, many more coastal states than were actually originally anticipated, have broad areas of extended continental shelf beyond their 200-mile claims. Australia is certainly one of the states that has taken great advantage of this. Australia has had 2.56 million square kilometres of additional maritime jurisdiction for extended shelf beyond its 200-mile limits, confirmed as under Australian sovereign rights. That's an area that's equivalent to the entirety of Western Australia, added to Australia's already extensive maritime spaces. And these extended shelf submissions, they go before a UN Scientific and Technical Commission, the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, and that has a role to play in the South China Sea disputes. And some of the reactions to those submissions that have been made in the South China Sea are really quite revealing. They've moved us forward in our understanding, our clarity over who claims what. Beyond these national coastal state claims, we have the high seas, and beyond the limits of the continental shelf, we have the so-called area, the international seabed area, under the jurisdiction of the International Seabed Authority. Now, I mentioned as another preliminary issue dealing with the question of islands. And this is a critical issue in the context of the South China Sea. In principle, all islands are to be treated in the same manner as mainland coastal territory. So they're entitled to the full suite of maritime claims, a 200-mile exclusive economic zone and potentially continental shelf rights that go beyond the 200-mile limit. As you can see from paragraph 1 of this is Article 121 of the Law of the Sea Convention, an island is naturally formed, an area of land surrounded by water, well, an island generally should be, I would suspect, and above water at high tide. So you've got a critical issue there in terms of defining what high tide is, a vertical datum issue if we're going to get technical about it, defining what is above and below the tidal level. But essentially that's not especially controversial. An area of land, certainly, our legal friends, commentators, legal scholars will analyze every single word in a legal text. So land has been a controversial issue. What do you mean by the word land? But in most cases, it's not a problematic issue. Surrounded by water, not a problem. Naturally formed is critical because one cannot build one's own island and then start claiming maritime jurisdiction from it. But all of those islands are supposed to be treated in the same manner as mainland coastal territory, except there's a special category of island called the rock, in paragraph 3 of Article 121. Rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or an economic life of their own shall not have an exclusive economic zone or a continental shelf. So that distinction between an island capable of extended claims and a mere rock which cannot claim the EEZ and the continental shelf can have enormous impacts and implications for the generation of maritime rights. And that is a critical issue in the context of the South China Sea, distinguishing between features that are capable of extended claims and rocks which cannot do so. We'll come back to that issue in a moment. Now, in terms of building up our picture, our spatial picture of the South China Sea, I am a geographer by initial training, so my role on an evening like this, when you're foregoing watching the Olympics in order to look at pretty pictures, is to actually provide you with some spatial entertainment, as it were. We're familiar with the geographical area. The claimant states to the South China Sea islands include China, states or entities I should say, China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and also Vietnam. But that's not the end of the South China Sea states, because Indonesia is demonstrably a coastal state on the South China Sea. It is just not a claimant state in terms of claims to sovereignty over the disputed islands. So there's a distinction there to draw between claimant states in terms of participants in the sovereignty dispute and coastal states. But what you can draw from that geographical image is that we have multiple states surrounding a semi-enclosed sea, and that has both spatial implications and also legal implications. The spatial implications is that we have multiple states focusing in towards one central area. The inevitable implication of that is there is a likelihood for their maritime claims to converge and overlap with one another. The legal implication is that under the law of the Sea Convention, Article 123 provides specific rules applicable to semi-enclosed seas. South China Sea is undoubtedly a semi-enclosed sea. There is an obligation on the coastal states to cooperate with one another. That's a virtuous and aspirational terminology that's contained within the Convention. What the Convention doesn't tell you is quite how that cooperation is to be engendered. The other key geographical feature about the South China Sea is the existence of multiple groups of islands in the South China Sea. Now, in the absence of a laser pointer, I'll probably bounce around a little bit here, and I'm sorry if I'm stepping away from the old audio system, but we have the Paracel Islands in the northwest, Kratas Island to the north, Scarborough Shoal or Reef to the east, and then the Spratly Islands. Now, the Spratly Islands themselves are said 8 square kilometers of land territory, but scattered over 240,000 square kilometers of maritime space. There's a degree of variance in the literature to answer the fairly simple question, how many Spratly Islands are there? And you can find estimates all the way up to 500. Most commentators would say 150 to 170 features. But when you drill down and you look at the sailing directions, look at the hydrographic information, only 48 of those features are actually above water at high tide. So while we have a profusion of insular features of various types, only 48 are above water at high tide. If we refer back to Article 121, you need to be a feature that's above high tide in order to generate claims to maritime jurisdiction. So only 48 of these features are even capable of generating a territorial sea, let alone an exclusive economic zone or a continental shelf. And then I'll turn to the issue of the role of islands in drawing maritime boundary lines in the latter part of the presentation. In order to generate claims to maritime jurisdiction, we need to define baselines. The default situation for coastal states is the normal baseline, so-called, which is the low water line along the coast. All of the South China Sea states have decided that their coastlines are complex enough to justify drawing straight line type baselines which are designed for particularly complex coastlines. We have 2 archipelagic states in the South China Sea, Indonesia and the Philippines. The rules on drawing archipelagic baselines are fairly strict. There are length limitations on the maximum length of archipelagic baselines. There's a ratio between land and water areas that must be fulfilled for compliant baselines. Both Indonesia and the Philippines have archipelagic baselines that are consistent with the law of the Sea Convention. Several other states have straight baselines. Now, the drafting of Article 7 dealing with straight baselines in the law of the Sea Convention is rather more loose and open to interpretation. You need a deeply indented or cut into coastline or a fringe of islands off the coast. But there's no further definition of how deep those indentations need to be, how deeply cut into the coast needs to be, how many islands make up a fringe. There is a UN expert report on this issue of straight baselines, and it tells us that for there to be a fringe of islands, you need more than one island. I kind of guess I could have got there myself without any expert report. But there we have, for example, Vietnam uses tiny islands far from the coast, joining them up with long, straight baselines. Highly questionable, to be protested by other states, including the United States. China's straight baselines are similarly problematic. Nonetheless, baselines are a key factor. Within those baselines, internal waters under the full sovereignty of coastal states are claimed, and that's why the protests have come in, because you're capturing large maritime spaces under the full sovereignty of the coastal state, restricting freedom of navigation. That's why the United States in particular has objected to these claims. From baselines, you start generating your 12-mile territorial sea claims, including from the disputed islands, the normal baselines, the low water lines around those disputed islands. So you have territorial sea claims. You could then start generating 200-mile limits from mainland coasts. And there you can see, slightly faintly I admit, a large pocket in the central part of the South China Sea that is beyond 200 miles from the mainland coasts. So that pocket is defined from normal baselines. If we use the archipelagic or straight baselines, that pocket shrinks somewhat, but you still have a high seas pocket in the central part of the South China Sea, unless the islands themselves are capable of 200-mile claims also. Now, I've selected a few of these islands, and I want you to bear in mind Article 121, which we rolled through in terms of the definition of an island capable of a 200-mile claim, or a mere rock that is incapable of human habitation or an economic life of its own. So we'll have a look at a couple of those. I'd like you to put your legal analysis hat on and say, well, is that an island that's capable of human habitation or an economic life of its own? It's not really quite long enough to accommodate an airstrip, so it's kind of been expanded to fit. But it has vegetation, it has buildings, so you could arguably say that it is an island capable of human habitation or an economic life. This is the largest Spratly Island. It's 1.4 kilometers long and about 300 meters wide at its widest point. So really we're dealing with extremely small fragments of territory. Scarborough Shoal, earlier on this year, was a key point of contention between China and the Philippines, particularly over fisheries rights in the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal. So my question again to you would be, an island capable of human habitation? One has a certain degree of doubt about that. It's a substantial feature in terms of the reef itself. It's a U-shaped reef. It encloses about 150 square kilometers of lagoon space, but only about 5 rocks emerge above high tide, the tallest of which is 3 meters tall. And it has been occasionally adorned with a flag and been occupied. But whether it constitutes an island capable of generating broad maritime claims is rather open to question, I would suggest. It's easy to think of the South China Sea as being an entirely disputed space. But in reality, there's been incremental progress towards resolution of bilateral disputes at the fringes, multiple agreed maritime boundaries between Indonesia and Malaysia, 2 segments in 1969, a further segment between Indonesia and Vietnam in 2003, 1992 agreement between Vietnam and Malaysia, 1958 boundaries defined by the UK on behalf of Brunei and Malaysia, and also China and Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin in the northwest. So the South China Sea is not immune from cooperative resolution of overlapping claims jurisdiction. There are also a number of joint arrangements of one type or another. There's a joint historic waters arrangement between Cambodia and Vietnam, which is a bit of an oddity. The Thai-Malay joint development area, where the overlap between both sides' claims has been defined as a joint development area for the purpose of exploiting seabed hydrocarbons, and that's been counted as a major success because gas has been discovered and is in the process of being exploited. Similarly, Vietnam and Malaysia, for the overlap between their maritime claims, a long, thin sliver of maritime space at the entrance to the Gulf of Thailand is defined as a joint development area. China and Vietnam, in addition to defining their maritime boundary for the Gulf of Tonkin, also defined a joint fishing zone that straddles the maritime boundary. And what we have there is, again in the Gulf of Thailand, we have essentially an agreement to agree between Cambodia and Thailand for a memorandum of understanding to enter into negotiations for both delimitation in the northern part of their overlap, but also joint development arrangements towards the south. And there were statements in the end of 2009 where Cambodia and Thailand were engaged in conflict on their land border over the temple issue, Temple Kea Bihan, that memorandum of understanding had been ripped up and abrogated by the Thai government, partially because of the temple incidents, but partially because the ousted Thai Prime Minister Thaksin had been appointed as an economics advisor to the Hun Sen government in Cambodia. So the Thai government was deeply unimpressed by that political move and threatened to abrogate that memorandum of understanding on joint development. It does not quite appear that that was formally carried through, and there are ongoing negotiations between Thailand and Cambodia that might yet yield a further joint development arrangement. There are also historic claims of one sort or another. We tend to, in South China Sea, hear a lot about the 9-dash line, the infamous Chinese 9-dash line. It's actually essentially based on an earlier claim, 1947, by the nationalist Chinese authorities, which consisted of 11 dashes, which you can see here. They're quite long dashes. The nationalist claim was inherited by the People's Republic of China, who dropped 2 dashes and placed their own dashes in a slightly different location, and they're slightly shorter dashes. Nonetheless, that evolved into a 9-dash line claim within the South China Sea, although the dashes do continue. You can see one there between Taiwan and Japanese islands at the southern end of the Ryukyu chain. China is not alone in pushing its seemingly historically based claims. The Philippines has a little bit, if I can call it, a schizophrenic attitude to the law of the sea. On the one hand, it has legislation that is compliant with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, is a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, and yet also advances maritime claims based on its so-called treaty limits, which are a succession of treaties from the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, which essentially define the territory of the Philippines. The Philippines' position is that all of the maritime space within, from the edge of its baselines to the edge of the box, the treaty limits box, consists of Philippines territorial sea. So on the one hand, as a party to the convention, which contains a limit of 12 nautical miles, the Philippines is bound by that as a party. On the other hand, it claims a territorial sea that at its widest extent goes to 285 nautical miles. Manages to have both of those claims on its books at the very same time. It'll surprise none of you that the Philippines has run into problems in trying to negotiate maritime boundaries with any of its neighbouring states, and has achieved no maritime boundary agreements with any neighbours, because whenever a neighbouring state sits down to negotiate with the Philippines, the issue of the treaty limits comes straight to the fore, and any potential equidistance-based maritime boundary cuts through the treaty limits and suddenly is highly problematic. Then we have a series of unilateral claims. The Philippines claims the so-called KIG around a series of the northern part of the Spratly Islands. Malaysia has defined a unilateral claim in the southern part of the South China Sea. Brunei has defined a corridor, and we're building up towards our spider's web of lines on the map. We then have, within Brunei's claim, for a long time Malaysia suggested that Brunei's maritime claim should stop at the 100 fathom limit and go no further, and therefore the Malaysian claims tended to ignore the entire existence of Brunei. They seem to have resolved that issue with a joint arrangement within Brunei's corridor of maritime space, but with those blocks licensed to Petronas, Malaysia's national petroleum company. So a compromised arrangement there. Indonesia, while it has agreed maritime boundaries with Malaysia and Vietnam in the South China Sea, they are seabed boundaries, they're continental shelf boundaries, not water column boundaries. So Indonesia has issued official mapping that suggests that Indonesia claims maritime spaces for water column that go significantly beyond its existing agreed seabed boundaries. We also have potentially a Singaporean claim in the southern part of the South China Sea, because the recent ICJ case between Singapore and Malaysia gave Singapore determined sovereignty over Petra Branca, the eastern end of the Singapore Strait, as belonging to Singapore. So there was a potential Singaporean exclusive economic zone in the far southwest of the South China Sea. We have had some potential progress towards joint arrangements among the South China Sea claimants, particularly the joint marine seismic undertakings between China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. This caused enormous controversy, particularly in the Philippines, when it became clear that the defined area, that shaded pink area, was substantially closer to the Philippines than any other state. So domestic position within the Philippines essentially has meant that that joint trilateral seismic arrangement has now ceased and has not been renewed. So it was potentially a breakthrough in the disputes, a great progress, but in reality has proved to not have been carried through to its full potential. We then in 2009 had two submissions made by Vietnam alone and then Vietnam and Malaysia jointly for extended continental shelf rights in the South China Sea. Those two wedges of maritime space. These are particularly significant for our understanding of how claims are becoming clearer, how they've evolved. Because the implication of those two submissions is that for Malaysia and Vietnam, the disputed islands are no more than rocks. Because if the disputed islands are capable of 200-mile claims, there is no extended continental shelf in the central part of the South China Sea. It's wiped out with the exclusive economic zones generated from the islands. Extended continental shelf can only be beyond the 200-mile zone claims of the made by coastal states. So the clear implication here is that these states regard the tiny South China Sea islands as no more than rocks. And that would be huge progress because it would limit the area under dispute. Unfortunately, the protest notes from China in reaction to these submissions make it clear that China doesn't agree. China's viewpoint, and this again is progress in terms of clarification of China's claims. China has said that the disputed islands, not only are they quote-unquote indisputably Chinese, but they are also capable of generating the full range of maritime claims. So whilst that sets the parties in starker differences, it becomes clearer that they have different positions, it nonetheless represents a certain degree of progress in terms of understanding these claims, because for a long period they've been highly ambiguous and uncertain. Now, turning to oil and gas issues, those are Vietnam's defined blocks. I'll draw your attention to one block in particular, number 148. Middle of last year, we had a cable cutting incident whereby Chinese vessels cut seismic cables of a survey vessel licensed to Vietnam. Now, if you can take from the reactions to the extended shelf submissions that China was increasingly talking the language of the Law of the Sea Convention, that it claims the islands and then maritime claims from the islands, that was huge progress because you could potentially limit the area in dispute. If you draw an equidistance line around the disputed islands, everything on the landward side, towards the mainlands, would presumably be undisputed, and that would shrink the area in dispute. But that doesn't match the actions on the water that China has been taking. And in particular, you can only justify the cable cutting incident, that enforcement action by China against Vietnamese survey activities, on the basis not of equidistance lines between the islands and the mainland, but on the basis of the 9-dash line. As you can see, the location of the cable cutting incident is significantly closer to the Vietnamese mainland than to the nearest disputed feature. So what we're seeing is enforcement action that suggests that China is claiming the entirety of the space within the 9-dash line. And just recently, in the last few weeks, we've seen the China National Offshore Oil Corporation issue a series of blocks off the east coast of Vietnam, which overlap with Vietnam's own concessions on offer and run all the way down the eastern coast of Vietnam. And again, you can see that they are only just within the 9-dash line. So again, it seems that China is claiming all the way to the edge of the 9-dash line. Just as an illustration of the actual occupation of features in the South China Sea, in particular the Paracel Islands, but also the Spratly Islands. Those are the features occupied by China and also Taiwan. Taiwan occupies a single feature, but it is the largest one in the Spratly Islands as well. And then we have the Philippines, and this is really just to illustrate how mixed up the garrisons are. There's been an opportunistic garrisoning and occupation of features in the South China Sea. So we have the Vietnamese and then the Malaysian occupations. And you can see that there are garrisons, occupied islands in very close proximity to one another, mixed up with one another. So do we have greater jurisdictional clarity? To an extent, yes, from the language that has been used, particularly in reaction to the extended continental shelf submissions. But that in turn has implications for islands and for maritime delimitation. Because if the coastal states can agree that the disputed islands, these small, insignificant features, are worthy of no more than a 12-mile territorial sea, that would be enormous progress in the dispute. Unfortunately, it does appear that China does not agree with that perspective. And in large part, that's because the only way that China can gain access to the maritime spaces and potential oil riches of the southern part of the South China Sea are on the basis of extensive claims from the disputed islands. You do tend to see in the South China Sea context the idea expressed that the islands are the key to the South China Sea dispute. That ownership over these tiny fragments of territory would determine ownership over broad maritime spaces. And certainly if you draw equidistance lines, median lines between the islands and the nearest parts of the mainland coasts, the islands are critical. But this overstates the issue. Even if we can't readily distinguish between what is an island capable of extended claims and what is a mere rock which cannot claim an EEZ, what has become clear from not only state practice but also cases before international courts and tribunals is that small islands with restricted coastal fronts, when pitted against mainland coastlines with long coastal fronts, those small islands are generally given a minimal or nil effect. In the two most recent cases, the Black Sea case before the International Court of Justice, the Bay of Bengal case before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, there's been a clear step forward in how maritime delimitation is approached. A three-stage process, drawing a preliminary delimitation line based on equidistance, and then looking at factors to shift it one way or the other. In both of those cases, though, the court or tribunal was selective about which base points to use. Islands were ignored, even at the first stage. Small islands do not generate broad maritime claims, certainly if you take it to an international court or tribunal. So in terms of enduring disputes, yes, we have a certain degree of clarity, but what we're also seeing is that China's actions are speaking louder than its words, and there are enforcement actions right to the limits of the 9-dash line. There's a whole series of those enforcement activities fisheries incidents with Indonesia, but also disruption of Vietnamese and Philippines oil exploration activities and the issuing of those concessions. Just to illustrate, I know I'm running out of time, but here we have a couple of fisheries incidents involving Indonesia and China. We take the 9-dash line and interpolate and join it up, which of course China has never done so, so there's a degree of constructive ambiguity there. We have Indonesia's archipelagic baselines and Indonesia's agreed boundaries, and then its forward position, its EEZ plane. We've had a series of incidents where Chinese fishing vessels have been arrested well within what Indonesia regards as its exclusive economic zone. Those arrests have taken place by the Indonesian enforcement authorities, and then a rather larger vessel has come around from these fisheries enforcement vessels and reportedly turned its guns towards the Indonesian vessel in one particular incident and suggested that the Indonesian authorities release said apprehended Chinese fishermen, all on the basis of the 9-dash line. The most recent evidence of that is through the issuing of concessions by China, which can really only be justified on the basis of the 9-dash line. And even the concession map provided by the China National Offshore Oil Corporation includes the 9-dash line on it. These concessions can only be justified on the 9-dash line, not on the basis of equidistance lines. So what's at stake? Very little territory, but critically sovereignty. There's been quite a lot of discourse over time in the social sciences about how the state is withering away and how sovereignty is under threat. That doesn't appear to be the case in this part of the world, particularly when you have states whose legitimacy is wedded to nationalism, and the link between the territorial state and its defined territory is critical. It's very difficult for states once they're made claims to actually compromise away from them, particularly where territory is at stake. Sea lane security is also critical. How long have I got, sir? Another hour? Well, I'll bounce through this very quickly, but just to demonstrate that there are sea lanes of critical importance. Half the global tonnage going through the South China Sea. We probably all heard of the Malacca-Singapore Straits and the critical choke point nature there. The South China Sea routes traditionally tend to go classically to the west of the Spratly Island group. And this speaks to the original British Admiralty designation for the Spratly Islands as dangerous ground. It's an area to be avoided, not to sail through. And indeed, in terms of the English language names of multiple Spratly Islands, they are based on the names of the ships that ran aground on those features. On American charting at least, there are 9 features called Pennsylvania, which does make for a unlikely ship. Alternatively, the other main route is via the Lombok-Makassar route, which either avoids the South China Sea completely or goes through the Balabac Strait and goes up the eastern side of the South China Sea. In terms of oil and gas resources and also fisheries resources, we tend to hear a lot about the South China Sea. It's difficult to distinguish the South China Sea from the words oil-rich. There's a perception that the South China Sea is some kind of El Dorado underlying it. I have to say that those suggestions are, to my mind, shaky at best. All of those estimates that we see are highly speculative simply because of the disputes. You're unable to take the kind of survey activities and exploration activities because those areas are disputed. And in reality, until you drill, even the survey data cannot really give you a true picture. You don't know oil and gas is there until exploratory drilling takes place. And that drilling is impossible in the context of the disputes that we have. The other issue I raised when one looks at the estimates that vary hugely. You can see the USGS estimates versus some of the Chinese estimates on screen, but those are resource estimates. That means really the amount of oil in situ in the ground, not a reserve estimate. When we talk to oil industry officials, the rule of thumb in the oil industry is that the reserve estimate for a frontier province would be about 10% of the resource estimate. So you need to be very careful about where it's being talked about and whether it's a resource or a reserve estimate that's in play. Similarly, the South China Sea is regarded as being likely to be more of a gas province than an oil province, and that has implications for development, particularly in the context of gas prices sinking with the advent of shale gas and access to alternative types of gas. And again, the gas estimates tend to include all forms of gas, including gas hydrates, where we do not possess the technology to actually access those resources and do not look like developing that technology in the near term. What I'd also suggest is that these resources, even if they do exist, they're not likely to meet the immediate concerns of these states who are facing serious energy shortages in the immediate term. Even if we solved all of these disputes tomorrow and started wholesale exploration activities, first oil would be in a decade's time, most likely. And that's not going to solve the problem that these states are facing in an immediate sense. What exploration can tell you, and geology can tell you, is where oil isn't. It can tell you where oil might be, but it can't guarantee it. But it can suggest to you quite strongly where oil is not. And you can see large areas. This is looking at the bathymetry of the southern part of the South China Sea, Philippines over here, Borneo, Vietnam, and you have large areas of deep water, but you do have some interesting pockets. And when you look at the sedimentary fill, what you do find is there's a large area of oceanic crust rather than continental crust. And there you're going to have zero hydrocarbons potential for a broad area of the southern part of the South China Sea. This explains really China's interest in generating claims from the islands here, because it will generate claims to those areas where there is depth of sediment where oil and gas may exist. In terms of rising tensions, yes, tensions are rising, and certainly the South China Sea is in the news. It's been in the news before. We tend to see a cycle of rising tensions and a smoothing off over time. I would expect that to continue. You see an action-reaction dynamic. Who's reacting to whom here? Each state believes that they're protecting their legitimate interests. And there's a lot of focus, certainly in the Western media, on the actions of China. China's done this, and it's contrary to international law. All of the claimant states are taking actions which you could interpret as being threatening to the other coastal states. So there's a real question there over how we frame those issues. In terms of the way forward, yes, international law is a way forward, and particularly the Law of the Sea Convention in terms of the obligation to cooperate. We are seeing some clarification of claims. Joint development keeps getting suggested as a solution. But without that clarity over who claims what, then you are always falling over the question of joint development where. You need some legitimacy to those jurisdictional claims as the basis for a defined joint development area. And that, currently, we are lacking. We do have mechanisms in place, the 2002 Declaration on the Code of Conduct, but we're 10 years on from that with no real implementation. We have great suggestions that we're moving towards a binding Code of Conduct. I would be extremely surprised if that we ended up with any agreement that really had teeth to it. So unfortunately, I'm ending and leaving you with somewhat of a depressing outlook of a continuation of this unstable status quo. We're having a ramping up of potential for incidents, but no real progress in terms of the conflict avoidance mechanisms that have been suggested even within the Declaration on the Code of Conduct, and no real sign that we're moving in a sustained way towards a conflict management framework. Thank you very much. I think that there is increasing militarization in the South China Sea, certainly. I think there is increasing opportunity for confrontation and for incidents. We are seeing states, and China is certainly a leader in this regard, trying to protect and assert their perceived rights within what they regard as their maritime space. They would view that as simply a legitimate protection of their own rights. But what you're doing in that scenario is putting armed vessels in close proximity to one another, and you are putting the fate of your bilateral relationship in the hands of a 19-year-old with a finger on the trigger. There is great potential for incidents. Whether I think that will expand, there is scope for escalation, but I think there's an awful lot at stake, and there's limited desire among the coastal states, no desire really, for that to become a conflagration and a major conflict. No, I don't see it as very much so. I mean, they certainly have no real interest in the sovereignty issues and no real desire to get embroiled in a conflict over tiny fragments of rock in the South China Sea. They have a long-standing and global interest in freedom of navigation. And we see that ourselves in the US protests over compulsory pilotage in Torres Strait. It all comes down to ensuring freedom of navigation over the broadest possible area of ocean space. And that is a key driver in US maritime policy. Well, in terms of claims to maritime space, China is expansive in the same way that all coastal states tend to try and be expansive, including our own. I would say that China feels particularly frustrated as a maritime state. I wouldn't put China in the same category as the disadvantaged states, geographically disadvantaged states, but nonetheless, China cannot assert a full 200-mile claim anywhere except in the South China Sea. All of it's got a very long coastline, but a much restricted maritime space. Everywhere to the east is constrained by the existence of the Japanese island chain, extending all the way down the eastern border of the East China Sea. You've got Philippines archipelago, and then the archipelagic and peninsular Southeast Asia. China's hemmed in. It's still got a substantial maritime space, but it's deeply frustrated by that. So yes, China is an expansive maritime power. I'm not sure I'm really answering your broader, grand geopolitical question, and I'm not sure I will until I've had a better one. All of the claimant states, if we're talking about claims to the territory, sovereignty claims, all of the claimant states base their claims on in some form history. China certainly asserts the longest term claim, usage over, first discovery and usage over a period of centuries. That is contested by the other claimant states, particularly Vietnam, which on one hand suggests that, well, actually we discovered these islands first and used them for centuries. Oh, and we base our claim on an inheritance from the French colonial administration also. I think the reality in terms of looking at it from an international legal perspective of the sovereignty claims is that none of the claimant states has a compelling case.
Including China?
Including China. Probably the strongest claim was that of Japan. In terms of long-term usage of the islands, acts of administration on the features. But in the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan gave up its claim, but didn't give it up in favor of anybody. So we're left with a series of states that often assert that their claims are indisputable and that there's actually nothing to talk about, that there's no point actually entering into negotiations, and our claims are based on centuries of history but with very little to actually back it up. And that, to an extent, I think, explains why there is great reluctance from any of the claimant states to even contemplate going to a third-party binding settlement on the issue of sovereignty, because none of them are especially confident. I would say that these are shipping routes of global significance, but they're of particular significance to the coastal states themselves, over and above any other interested parties. So this is a powerful argument. They are certainly significant routes, but it's a powerful argument for why any disputes over the South China Sea should not escalate into warfare, because who has most at risk? It's those states themselves. And if we look at the energy security scenario, if we take the projections to 2020, we're potentially looking at a quadrupling in tanker traffic to meet the divergence between plateauing and declining domestic production of oil and escalating demand on the current projections. So those shipping routes are only going to become more and more significant. But the South China Sea is not the only way to reach many of those ports. I highlighted very briefly the Lombok-Makassar route. Most of the focus is on Malacca Strait. Malacca-Singapore Strait is the key choke point. But in terms of tonnage of oil particularly, the VLCCs, the very large crude carriers, tend to use the Lombok-Makassar route because it's deeper. The Malacca Strait isn't necessarily that deep. So once they've offloaded their cargo, then they go back through the Malacca Strait when they're in water. But there are alternative routes. So I would agree that the South China Sea islands issue and dispute really shouldn't necessarily impact heavily on those strategic waterways. Well, I'll reframe the question because it's hard. And essentially emphasize that the issue of islands and maritime claims. I actually think that the sovereignty question over the islands doesn't matter. Who owns the islands doesn't matter an awful lot, because I genuinely don't believe that the scale of features that we are dealing with, there's a limited number that are above water at high tide. They are uninhabited, they have no indigenous population, they have extremely limited coastal fronts. If you put those features into a delimitation equation to a third-party tribunal or the International Court of Justice, they would be awarded a 12-mile territorial sea and nothing more. I would reframe the debate to putting islands in their proper context. Rather than being the keys to this dispute, they are irritants in the South China Sea. There's an awful lot of focus on the islands, but in reality, they should be minimized in their significance. And that is the way to move forward in a debate about how to define areas that you could then are subject to overlap and could then be subject to some kind of joint arrangement.
With the base that they'd have 200 miles around, and then there's exceptions.
Yeah, but many of the claimants, China in particular, isn't keen on that scenario.